Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Gregory Wilbert coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. We're continuing now on part 2 of our interview with Antony Loewenstein, who is the author of Disaster Capitalism, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. Thanks again, Antony, for being with us here today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
I just want to look at another situation. I mean, you make also you also analyze countries such as the US and Britain. Just tell us also, how does disaster capitalism manifest itself in a country such as Britain? And what I'm also wondering, is there any difference in its manifestation in the countries of the North compared to a country of the so-called Third World?
That's a good question. Look, in many ways, yes and no. On the one hand, of course, although poverty in countries like Britain is incredibly high, it's actually growing, inequality is rising. Obviously, the situation is not the same as, say, Afghanistan in the UK. Of course, it's not. But what you do find in a place like Britain, my focus there was immigration, and how in the last couple of decades, in both governments of Labour, which is a so-called left party, and the Conservative Party, have privatised and outsourced immigration detention. So thousands upon thousands of immigrants have come to the UK in the last decades. They're often housed in incredibly poor conditions. They are mistreated, they're often abused. Some of them have died, some have been sexually assaulted. I visited some of these facilities across the UK a few years ago. And what I found there was real devastation. People who even were released from these facilities are often put in incredibly poor housing, organised by companies like G4S and Serco. And the reason I wanted to do that, to show that, was to explain that those companies also operate in the US, and they also operate in Australia in exactly the same area. In other words, when companies like Serco or G4S move to Australia, which they have in the last couple of decades, it's almost like the political powers that be and much of the media elite either ignore or don't care the fact that their records of service in the UK and the US has been very, very poor. So to me, the book does not, for example, argue that the US is the same as Papua New Guinea. But what I am saying is that there are examples in all those countries, both the West and the rest, as I say, where the same corporations are involved, the same ideology, the same positions of various corporations and governments. And the only way that's actually going to change is if there are locals rising up. And I might also add that aid organisations that often are furthering and worsening these problems are often held to account. In other words, they do not, this is what they often do in places like Haiti, do not often employ locals in jobs when, after, say, a massive earthquake in 2010. And to me, having accountability, bringing real accountability to a place like Haiti or Papua New Guinea or Afghanistan is so important. And too often, I think aid organisations that sometimes mean well often are not delivering those goods.
One of the things, I mean, aside from the lack of accountability that I think you mentioned also, is that there's a certain amount of callousness and also a growth in right-wing movements that help promote disaster capitalism. But have you seen anything that undermines this tendency? Anything? You mentioned actually earlier, but what in general do you think can be done to move away from this callousness and this lack of accountability?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a difficult question, because one of the problems at the moment is that when, for example, in Afghanistan or Iraq after 9/11, when there's obviously been wars that's gone on now for 15 years or so, when Afghanistan at least, is that when contractors, both foreign and local, are killed, or they are injuring locals, or they're sexually abusing locals, this does not seem to become, with a few exceptions, a political issue in the US or the UK. In other words, it's almost this sort of global, multinational unaccountability mechanism. What there needs to be, for one, is actually a legal mechanism instituted both by the UN and others to hold these organisations to account. If US and British courts are not willing to, for example, hold companies like G4S or Serco or Blackwater to account, and there are some exceptions where they have, but in general they don't, there needs to be an international legal body to do so. There have been a few moves in the last few years to institute some kind of global contractor legal facility that allows certain corporations like G4S, Serco and others to be held to account. Nothing has happened yet. And I think also one of the things, and I speak as a journalist here, is that too often journalism is embedded. And when I say embedded, I mean that embedded not so much just with the military, which is what embedding usually means, but embedded with the powerful. And one of the importances for me with this book and a lot of my work in the last decade or so is that journalism should not just be about speaking to people in power, politicians, the media, and others. It needs to speak to from the ground up. And if I think people in the West and the rest and much of the world are far more informed about what their corporations are doing in their name, I like to think they'd be more likely to want to hold them to account. For example, there also could be pressure through shareholders. There could be pressure through various local campaigns. There can be also pressure on governments to pressure these corporations. There are ways that this can be done. 350.org is a great example, an environmental group which has put a lot of pressure on fossil fuel providers and had some degree of success in pressuring individuals and corporations that invest in these dirty energy sources, and often they're divesting. That could be a very effective way for shareholders to be pressured with companies like G4S and Serco and others. So there is hope. It's not a hopeless situation. But one of the things I try to do in the book is to at least make people more aware of what's going on so they can become more empowered.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but just to make a quick connection to one of the things, or actually two of the things that you said. One is that, of course, we hope at the Real News that we do something similar to the kind of journalism that you're talking about. And the other point I wanted to make is that that here in Ecuador, actually, there's been a movement, or actually the government is promoting the idea under President Rafael Correa to hold corporations accountable to human rights standards. So that sounds kind of similar to the point you were making about holding companies accountable, right?
Is your sense that the new Ecuadorian government will have a similar point of view?
I hope so. I'm not sure, but I think so, yes.
Let's hope so. Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Antony, for having joined us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.